So when I gave an NAB wrap-up in New York, they, in checking, discovered it was the 21st annual NAB wrap-up I did for them. So they asked me to maybe do some historic stuff, and I'm not going to show all of that, but just a little that seemed to be relevant. So here is some stuff that was at NAB in 2005. At the upper left is the RED20, which was the precursor for the Alexa, the first commercial high dynamic range camera. Next to that is a Sony camera that had 1080p, at least internally. Under that was Belden talking about doing video over IP. Next to that is Immersive Media's ice cream cone camera for doing 360 surround. Next to that, a Sony 4K projector. Up at the top, P2 and XD cam were introduced for HD, and then there was stuff that didn't really go anywhere. This I point out only because of the recent Simpsons live episode. Everyone was so exciting, wow, you can do animation live. Well, in 2015, this company, Hello Stage, was selling live animation software for $20. 2006, Sony was selling 4 versions of HD displays in 4 different aspect ratios. And so everyone said, well, no problem. Yes, this is 10 years after the digital transition began, but we can use AFD, bar data, and pan and scan to take care of all that stuff. And so last fall, the New Yorker ran this cartoon. So we haven't quite solved that problem yet. This was shown at the SMPTE Digital Cinema Summit in 2008 by Grass Valley. And I'm not sure how much you can see under these conditions, but every coil of the filament is visible, and on the display I'm looking at, every one of the chips on the chip chart is visible. So there's a 10 million to 1 contrast ratio in that image, or more than 23 stops. This was shown at NAB in 2009 by Japan's National Institute of Communications Technologies, and it was a live hologram, and the image was actually a hologram, but the camera that was picking it up was a light field camera. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. This was 2010, the elephant in the room. Of course, you must all make the transition to 3D. And so here were 2 of my favorite 3D quotes from 2010. Buzz Hayes, very good 3D person, saying making 3D is easy, making good 3D is hard. And then Jay Ankeny from TV Technology saying 3D at the NAB show seemed to be a profit motive in search of a market. High dynamic range imaging, also at that same show, 2010. The ARRI Alexa came out, and Live Technologies Live Lens interposing an LCD in the focal plane to reduce overall contrast. Then at the Digital Cinema Summit in 2011, discussions of 4K, high frame rate, high dynamic range, wider color gamut, and there was a bit of a shift in 3D. We went from NAB in 2010 when we absolutely had to be 3D and everyone was 3D and the 3D was lousy to, hey, we could do 3D and the 3D was better, but there was only some of it. This was 2012. You can see the blister on my foot is covered over. NAB is all work in 2012. And Canon introduced a 4K reference display. Wow, Canon makes displays. 2013, 3 different light field technologies were discussed. The Lytro Fly's Eye camera, that's a very small thing I'll show you later. The Fraunhofer 6-camera rig, and the MIT coded aperture. And SMPTE changed the name to the Technology Summit on Cinema. The elephant in the room in 2013 was 4K. And there were all these products that were available. 2014, Atomos started using sex to attract buyers. You may see in the background a topless woman. I am very pleased to report that this year they decided not to do that anymore. This was also 2014 at NAB, and you can see large empty spaces. And that was actually not the case this year, I'm also pleased to report. So in 2015, those of you who were here last year may recall I told you about the Fraunhofer light field array. They had previously shown refocusing in post, reframing in post, and re-irising in post, or higher dynamic range for change of depth of field. At NAB 2015, they showed relighting in post, and that's something I showed you. For those of you who didn't see it, I have a little URL here, bit.ly/f-LF, or Fraunhofer light field. And the URL for these slides was at the beginning, it'll be at the end again, and they're already posted. So this was the theme of NAB in 2016, Unleash. And if this is what happens to your video when it's unleashed, maybe better to keep it leashed. This was by far the most attended event at NAB. I would say it was standing room only, except there wasn't even standing room. If anyone fainted, they would not have fallen down. This was the introduction of the Litro cinema camera. Now, it's in that picture. You might not notice it. It's not this camera over here. That's the Litro cinema camera. It's about the size of a coffin that I would fit into. It's about 7 feet long and 3 feet wide and weighs something like 600 pounds. This is that little camera I was showing before. That was the first Litro consumer product. This is a later Litro camera. Now, this is an amazing camera. It's got 755 raw megapixels. Just to give you an idea of how much that is, HD is 2 megapixels. 4K is 8 megapixels. 8K is 32 megapixels. This is 755. And will operate at 300 frames a second and has 16 stops of dynamic range. And it'll do refocusing and change of depth of field and reframing and relighting and depth keying and tracking. And to Litro's credit, they showed all the software that was necessary for doing this. Everyone in the room was impressed. I was impressed. But why do we have to go to that when Fraunhofer has this little array of cameras that can do the same kind of stuff? So here's tracking that Fraunhofer showed this year. There's a tracking shot out a window, somebody walking by, and so let's see what the outside shot looks like. So there's the outside shot. Here comes the person to walk, and look, we can freeze him and move the shot around without moving the camera. So that's one of the reasons that light field is exciting. Here was another sort of light field. This is really only 3-camera system, but from NCAM, and they introduced a new thing which was a light sensor. One of the fastest things to indicate to you that something is wrong in the picture is if the lighting is different from what you've put into the picture and what the background is. So they have this sensor that tells not only the intensity and the color of the light, but also the directions that the light is coming from. And it was great because I was at a demo and one of the lights fell over. And the light falls over, the sensor recalculates, and it changes the light on everything, so everything matched again. This was NAB in 2010. This is during NAB. This is not set up or anything. This is the South Hall upper. Tremendous amount of empty space. This is this year. Was all full. I didn't see any empty space. There were a couple of little parks, as I like to call them, around the show floor, but they were little. Attendance was actually down 107 people, but you couldn't prove it from the show floor. There were more people on the show floor, in my opinion, than there generally were in 2015. But exhibit space was up significantly, another 50,000 square feet. Now, part of that was because NAB had all of these things that I call lands. They called them different things like pavilions, experiences, parks, and so on, loft. But there was advanced advertising land, drone land, ATSC 3.0 land, and so on. And this is one that was not an official NAB one. I call it LED walls land. And it ranged from 0.8 millimeter pixel pitch and 8K resolution to this at the DeSisti booth. Each of those pixels is about an inch, so fairly large. But this was one that was not in LED walls land, but everyone was very excited about it. It's an 8K wall movie screen size. So really great if you can afford it. This was another one of the lands, ATSC 3.0 land, as I call it. And you just heard in the last presentation part of the ATSC 3.0 conundrum. There's no second channel that you're being given, so you have to share houses, as was said. There are no ATSC 3.0 TV sets. There's no government-paid converters. So what do? Well, this was one of the things that was at ATSC 3.0 land. And you heard a little bit about that in the last presentation. Also, it's an ATSC 3.0 to Wi-Fi converter. So you just stick that anywhere you want in a window, wherever you get good reception, and it turns it into Wi-Fi that TVs can already receive. This was another thing in ATSC 3.0 land. It was, to me, the most intentionally funny thing at NAB, and it was comedy rugby. Now, the rugby players didn't know they were in a comedy, so they were playing rugby as they normally do. The sounds of the players from the field was all normal rugby sound, but they mixed the audios. So they had the natural sound from the field, and they added a commentator who was talking about someone's mother and how he was playing with his brothers, and they were doing all this stuff, and it was quite funny. And they were showing this in ATSC 3.0 land, like, wow, this is some new technology in ATSC 3.0 that's going to allow us to do this. But it's not the technology, because all of that was available in A52, which came out in 1995. But as a political or an economic political move, the TV set manufacturers decided not to go for the mixed audios. And by deciding not to go for the mixed audios, there was no possibility of doing this stuff that was shown. Another little audio thing at NAB, Sennheiser introduced this little camera top mic that picks up things in the distance and close, quite nice. This was another cute thing I saw, Soft Panels Auto Color. This was actually a Kickstarter campaign, and they raised more than they were expecting. The lights have built-in color sensors. And so they will adjust when you hit the auto button over there to whatever the ambient lighting is. The light coming in from the window, the light that's coming from the lamps, whatever. And so then you do a white balance on your camera and you're all set. This was another cute LED thing at the show. Yes, there have been LED Fresnel lights for a while now, but what about all those old Fresnel lights that have incandescent lamps in them? So Vision Smith says, no problem, we'll make an LED incandescent lamp replacement. You just pop it in and it becomes an LED light. This was in drone land, and I'm not sure if the mesh is to protect us from the drones or the drones from us. But this was in the South Hall. It's a non-droning drone. And there it is up in the air. It does make a little bit of noise when the steering propellers are activated. Perfectly legal to have indoors, over people, whatever. But this was an interesting thing in drone land. It's an anti-droning drone that the New Zealand government has been funding. And these are actually sound pictures. So there's a standard drone, and you can see the dark reds are loud noise. There's a reason they're called drones. Bzzz. But this is with their passive filtering, which is changing the way that these are designed. And there's lots of noise above the drone, but not much noise below the drone. And then for the noise that remains below the drone, they're working on active filtering, as Panasonic did in one of its projectors a while back. This is from Hoodman. And Hoodman has had monitor hoods for a long time. And when you're using a drone, you have a monitor, and so you would put a Hoodman monitor on it. But in case that doesn't sell, let's change the name and call it a drone aviator hood. Here is a lens that was introduced at the show, a Fuji lens. What's interesting about it is it's the largest zoom range that was shown at the show. I would say it's the largest zoom range, except Panavision once showed a 300 times compound zoom. And it's a 4K lens. Now, what does 4K lens mean? Doesn't mean anything. You could take 4K and stick it through a piece of Coca-Cola bottle glass. But it does have new coatings on it, so it has more transmissivity. and therefore it's an HDR lens. And what's interesting about this is that's the only version that Fujinon showed that lens in. So they didn't show a 107:1 HD lens, they showed a 107:1 UHD lens. So that train has kind of left the station. Here's another 4K camera and lens combo. It looks kind of like a lens, but it's actually got the camera in it too. Integrated 12 times optical zoom, HD base T, and under $3,000. HD base T, by the way, is there, and that looks like it's an IP connection, but it's not. It's all of the video, audio, control, power over IP type cabling, but it's not IP, although you can transmit IP over that also. Now, some IP at the show, everyone's excited about the Aja Kona IP board, but lots of different versions of IP, except it's not quite that bad. These light yellow ones are all incorporated in most of those bottom ones. NewTek joined the Aspen community, even though they have their own thing. Sony joined the Ames community. Evertz joined the Ames community, but NewTek did not yet join the Ames community. But it's working out. You can already do IP, and it's only going to get better from here. So here was a 4K camera shown at the show, the Grass Valley LDK86N. Last year they introduced the LDK86, which had a 4K output that was up-converted from 3 HD sensors. The N stands for native, and so it's now got 3 4K sensors, and it has dynamic pixel management, so that means, A, you can buy it as an HD camera, and when you want 4K, you can pay them for a license, and it'll turn into a 4K camera. But also it means that these are the sizes of the pixels when it's in 4K mode. These are the sizes of the pixels when it's in HD mode, and you can capture a lot more photons in the HD mode. So as far as HDR is concerned, you might actually prefer that to that. And that has a real IP interface, by the way. Here's another camera introduced at the show from Sony. The HTC 4800 does 4K at 480 frames per second. And Jason Dackman of Sports Video Group at the NAB wrap-up in New York said this is a real game changer. Everyone is just amazed at this. It's extraordinary. But at NAB 2012, Foray introduced this camera that did 4K at 900 frames per second. And not only did they introduce it at NAB, but it was used by CBS in Super Bowl 2013. So what's the big deal with this camera? Money matters. And so Foray came up with a cheap version of their camera that can only do 500 frames per second instead of 900 frames per second. Sony also introduced this camera, which I thought was interesting because they have a single sensor 2/3 inch format 4K. That's something that I haven't seen outside of the prosumer range previously. JVC had this interesting camera that lets you do graphics in the camera. So you can do scores, you select what the sport is that you're doing, and you can enter all the necessary information. There was a large virtual reality world or virtual reality land at NAB, and this was one of the things there, the Nokia Ozo camera, which has 8 cameras and 8 microphones and can give you a surround view. And Assimilate came up with this for doing post on it, so you can pick which one of those cameras you want to look at. And there's even a virtual reality truck, which is kind of strange because in virtual reality, the idea is you're supposed to be able to look around in each direction, and this is blocking the view of what's behind it. This was somebody else at the virtual reality land, the Center of Human-Centered Interaction for Coexistence. Strange name for this Korean organization, but actually some fun stuff that they had. They had virtual button pushing. You could stick your finger and do things. You could have what Microsoft has been calling teleporting, where you see someone else in front of you and you can interact. So I did that, and the two of us being geeks, all we did was, hello, hello. And that was the extent of our interaction. But the problem was that he saw a guy wearing virtual reality goggles, and I saw a guy wearing virtual reality goggles, and we could have been anybody. So this was somebody else at Virtual Reality Land, live-like, and they're talking about just like being there. Well, yeah, you know, the game part is probably okay. Maybe the resolution is not so good yet. But this part, the high-fiving, you know, who are you high-fiving? It's another creature wearing some kind of goggles. This was an interesting camera at the show. It's a 4K camera, but it's got only 720p output. Now, why is that? Well, 4K is 2160 lines. And if you divide 2160 by 3, you get 720. And the sideways is 3840, and if you divide that by 3, you get 1920. So it delivers 9 720p pictures, and you can actually cut a show from that one camera. And how would you do that? Well, here was another thing introduced at the show, automatic TV, and you can simply set up, again, you know, what is the sport? It's football. What stadium are you at? And so on. Go cut a show for me. And then you go out and eat. With all of these streams that are going to be coming from this automatic show cutting, the question is, how do you figure out where anything is? And so Velosa was introducing artificial intelligence for that purpose. Ross came out with cameras, and the big question is kind of like when Grass Valley did. Grass Valley makes cameras? Ross makes cameras? That's the main thing everyone was saying. It is a very low noise camera, and it has this thing called ultra chrome output. If you're doing color replacement keying, it gives you full resolution. This was a session on next generation television, and there was remarkable consensus, except on clothing and facial hair, that 4K doesn't give you much bang for the buck, but the sets are out there. And so that train has left the station. HDR does give you a lot of bang for the buck, but it's not yet ready to be delivered. So given all that confusion, Ken Kirschbauer from Sports Video Group says, we need a Moses and quick. And so here's Sony, and they say, don't worry, you know, we are beyond definition. But this is the rest of the ad that they had. We're beyond definition, but we're 4K. So again, the 4K TVs are out there, the Pro Gear is out there, and then here's something that Jason Dackman again said, that it was amazing that these guys showed uncompressed 4K workflows within an IT infrastructure. Why is that so amazing? Because uncompressed 4K is, in theory, about 12 gigabits, and they're sticking it in a 10 gigabit Ethernet network. Now, you can do that because it's really not 12 gigabits. There's a lot of stuff in there besides the video. But that's a major accomplishment. So other people are saying, well, for now, if you're going to do 4K over IP, you need mezzanine compression, which is some low level of compression. But at the show, there were at least 7 varieties of that: the BBC D-Rock or SMPTE VC2, Evert's J2K, Fraunhofer's Lisi, Intopix's Tico, Nutec's NDI, Sony's low latency video codec, and Vnova's Perseus. And they're all incompatible. And they all only need to last basically until we get 25 gigabit Ethernet. And then we don't have any problem carrying this. And there are production, distribution, and perceptual interactions that we need to deal with. And of course, there was 8K2, and this was at one of the Canon areas. And there are 2 amazing things from this picture. One amazing thing is this guy is showing a very high power magnifying glass. You can see it has a little extra magnifier in there. And he is looking at a photograph that was taken from video, and he cannot see anything wrong with that picture. So 8K is giving him photographic quality. The number 2 thing is you can't tell it's 8K unless you have a really powerful magnifier in front of you. This is not the first time that we've had battles over resolution or talking about 3D or different versions of compression. Those of you who were at NAB in 1983-84 might remember that the elephant in the room was teletext. Everyone had to go teletext right away, and the question was, are you going to go North American Broadcast Teletext Standard, or are you going to go World System Teletext? And so those are two versions that people were looking at. A lot of high dynamic range stuff at the show. Atomos converted their whole line to HDR monitors, 1500 nits. A nit is a candela per meter squared, but it's shorter than saying candela per meter squared. TV Logic, 600 nits. This was a Panasonic demo, and as most HDR demos are, it was in a dark room, as you can see from there. So I've blown it up some more, and now I've blown up just this little section over here, and so there you can see the monitor that Panasonic was using. Now, it's not new for Panasonic to be using a Sony monitor. What's new is for them not to put a piece of black tape over it. So that is significant because that means that the manufacturers are saying, hey, we have to get together and make this happen and do whatever is necessary to get it out there. This is the new consumer standard, and they give you two versions of HDR. You can be either from 1,000 nits or more peak brightness down to 0.05 nits of black level, which you might do with an LCD, or from 540 nits of peak brightness down to 0.0005 nits of black level, which you might do with an OLED. Now here, this is what was shown at the SMPTE Technology Summit on Cinema in 2014. And this was from the École Polytechnique Fédérale Lausanne, a Swiss institution, but they compared it to the EBU numbers, and there's very high correlation. Basically, everybody is saying this. It's wonderful, and this is the stuff that people show to say HDR is great. But what are they measuring over here? So here's that horizontal axis. They're not measuring contrast ratio. They're not measuring dynamic range. They're measuring brightness. And yes, people prefer brighter images. Now, when you have something that has bright images on it, the light is coming off the screen, and some of it is going into your eye, but some of it is bouncing off your face and going back to the screen. And some is bouncing off the rear wall and going back to the screen. And some is bouncing off the ceiling and going back to the screen, or the floor and going back to the screen. So Pete Ludet, who some of you may know, he's Senior Vice President at RealD. Their scientists went into theaters and they found that reflection, the most reflection in a movie theater auditorium is from the audience. And sure enough, you can see it there. You can barely make out that there are chairs, but you can certainly see all the people who are watching the movie. So, for best results, HDR should be shown in an empty auditorium. But again, it's only an issue when the screen is bright. So here you can see a bright screen, and you can see it illuminating the ceiling and everything else. So Pete came to another conclusion, which was for best HDR results, the screen should be black. Which means that if we're talking about 0.0005 nits, then this might be the viewer attire that's required for HDR. Now, this was at the Harmonic booth. There you see HDR on a display. There you see SDR on a display. Clearly, this is just a dimmer version of this. That works out perfectly. This is SDR to HDR up conversion, and I'm not sure what that is. It's clearly not the same as this or that. So that, I don't think it works so well. But going in the other direction, HDR to SDR, that does work very well. These three organizations were all showing conversion at the show. And IsoVideo has a fully automatic converter, no controls on it whatsoever. So they got some content from the Media University in Stuttgart. And the way that they shot their content was with a mirror rig with two ARRI Alexas. One of them stopped down, so they have a guaranteed more than 18 stops of dynamic range there. At the HPA Tech Retreat in 2015, Jan Fröhlich from the Media University was showing some of the high dynamic range, high color gamut stuff. But now I'm going to show you that same thing in the background there as processed by IsoVideo. So I'll just leave that up for a bit. Nothing is blooming. Here are all these light bulbs. Nothing is clipping at all. None of these lights are clipping. You can see the little light on top of the tower. You can see the faces of all the people here, and we're in horrendous viewing conditions. right now. A lot of light on this screen, a lot of light on any of the screens. So you are saying, oh, well, yeah, anybody can do a still image. So here's some video, and I think I screwed it up a little bit in getting the videos onto my computer, but you'll still get an idea of this. Nothing is clipping, and if you look in the flame there, you can see the center of the flame is brighter than the outer part of the flame, so there's clearly no clipping there. So here's another one. Those of you in the front might see some dust motes floating through the air. He calls over the waiter. The waiter immediately comes over because there's a woman sitting back here, and who cares about women? You know, we serve the men first, and she's ticked off that that happened. And so she decides she's going to do something about it, and she gets up. And you can see his feet now falling backward. So again, this was stuff that was shot by the Media University in Stuttgart. Minimum 18 stops of dynamic range in there, and the SDR conversion by ISO video extremely good. Just about anything you can need for shooting HDR was available. Leader came out with this scope, and if you're shooting HDR, maybe you'd say, oh, well, I don't care if the headlights are blooming, but maybe I don't want the clipping on the tent. This was a camera system, Z-Cam. Basically, they had an array of cameras so they could freeze stuff. They had NAB showgoers jump up in the air. They tried to capture them during the jump, and then they would give them a video going around them. This was a new unit, the data ton, which is what we have to deal with for archiving and so on. And this was cute. This was something that Blackmagic came up with. They called it a duplicator, a 4K duplicator, but it's got an H.265 encoder built in, and all of these little slots are SD card slots, and each one has 25 slots. So as shown on this table, it could make 125 copies, and if you got rid of the monitors and the blank panels there, you could have 250 copies. So you bring this to some event that you're doing, like SMPTE Bits by the Bay, and hey, you know, $40, you can get a video of everything that was done today. Not a bad price. Shutterstock, this was very interesting that they are now acquiring 4K footage, and so they were there pitching people to provide that. And this is from someone else, their view of NAB 2016. Everything you own is obsolete before you even buy it. So once again, these slides are available at bit.ly/bbtb, as in Bits by the Bay, -NAB16. They're already online. You can download them now.